Okay, so the principles of training. First of all, I'd like all of you to kind of think of the principles of training as what I refer to as the golden rules. I probably should have written that in gold, but the golden rules of training, okay? The golden rules of training. In other words, if we follow these principles as either the coach, the trainer, or indeed the athlete, then the training should be effective. Please fix that concept in your mind, because it's exactly what we are referring to within these ideas. So again, as much as you study this in kind of an academic structure here, I hope that you also apply these principles in any kind of physical activity or fitness development, and indeed can be applied very, very well as well to skill development in all kinds of different areas. I mean, I'll give you a good example. What my elder daughter does piano lessons, and I apply the principles of training with her, not because it's a physical experience, but because the principles of training are very, very effective at developing structures which help the learning process as well as the fitness and adaptation process. God, I wasn't expecting to talk about that, but it's just an interesting idea. I mean, I wonder if some of you can criticize what I just said. And I'm going to go through these rules kind of one at a time. So let's get started, and once we've done one, perhaps we'll get the idea of how this might apply to different athletes down here. So the first principle I'd like to develop with you is what we call specificity. Specificity. It's kind of an interesting word to say. It's got a lot of I's in it and finishes with a Y, which is kind of an interesting one. But specificity. So basically what we're saying here is we're making training specific to something. Now, I don't think that's going to surprise anybody. Would we kind of just train generally, not really related to what we're trying to achieve? No, we're going to be specific with it. So how do we do this? How do we make our training specific? So first of all, training can be specific to something like a muscle group. Okay, so let's look at our different examples we've got here. So clearly someone like Froome is going to need extremely absolutely bulletproof muscles of the legs, right? It's going to be really, really important. Jess Ennis here for her long jump technique. It's really important that she has excellent flexibility at the shoulder and at the back. Okay, so we can work on the flexibility of those muscles, for example. Our footballer down here, we could begin talking about the musculature of the legs, of course, but again, we could be talking about the importance of a strong core because they need that correct posture and technique. So there could be all kinds of different specific muscle groups that we would think about there. Now the next thing, can't remember which yellow I had, probably a different one. Oh, pretty close. Next thing, we can also be specific to what we call the component of fitness. Okay, and we've had a look at this in previous studies, but the component of fitness, of course, someone like Froome, say, we're going to be doing an awful lot of work around cardiovascular endurance. Someone like Ennis Hill, we're going to be doing a lot of work around the component of fitness of power. Someone like Katie Chapman here, we're going to be doing a lot of work around muscular endurance, power, speed, and cardiovascular endurance, more of an all-round kind of athlete, but we can make training specific to that component. And of course, it then suggests which method of exercise, which method of training we use. And finally, and it kind of really does lead on for what I said before, we can look at the energy system. So if we broadly consider that Ennis Hill, in the majority of her performances, is an anaerobic athlete, then of course we can develop the anaerobic energy systems, whereas predominantly, by far, Froome is an aerobic athlete, we're going to tend to develop the aerobic energy system. Katie Chapman is more, as a midfielder in football, is very aerobic, but also does a lot of anaerobic work, so she's going to do a lot of threshold work, working in between. So we make training specific in those ways. Let's move on. Let's now have a look at the idea of progression. Okay, that's a very nice light minty green. So the idea of progression. So with progression, we are talking about increasing the frequency, the intensity, and the duration of exercise. But before we get to the concept of overload, I'd like you to realize that what progression tells us is that this increase in training load should be gradual and steady. Okay, so yes, we're going to increase something like the intensity of training, but we're going to do it in a deliberate sense, gradual and steady increases. And if you think about why we do that, why wouldn't we just kind of go crazy and do loads of training all at the start? So there's some reasons for that. We do not break what we call moderation. Moderation can also be considered a principle of training in many senses, and what it is like, don't overtrain, either physically or emotionally and mentally. Don't train so much, don't progress so rapidly that you kind of burn out quickly. And the other point we make about progression is that we tend to increase duration first. So generally speaking, when we progress our training load, we'll increase duration primarily. There are many exceptions to that. Okay. Now, we have an associated concept here, and it's the concept of overload. In many of our studies, we'd even refer to it as progressive overload. But I'd like you to make notes here and understand the concept of overload. Overload is the idea, built on top of progression, of stressing the body. And what we mean by that is we do enough work so that the body is kind of stressed to a point where it needs to respond to the additional work that's being done. And the reason we do that is that this stressing causes a physiological process to occur called adaptation. Okay, adaptation is when if we train hard enough and we do more than we're used to, either by frequency, intensity, or duration, then our body's going to rebuild itself stronger, and we call those physiological or physical adaptations. Now, the other point I would make to you about overload is that adaptations occur during rest. So can we go back to the previous point when we said that we must have progressive development, gradual and steady? That sort of insinuates and suggests that we also build resting into our program. So if Froome, even though he's a hyper elite athlete, if he literally trains 365 days a year, which I'm assuming he doesn't, then of course what's likely to happen there is that lack of rest is not going to allow the body to recuperate and to adapt within those periods of rest. And of course it's going to break the principle of progression because it's not going to be gradual and steady increases. So I guess theoretically you could build up to that, but well, not really. So let's move this on. In fact, no, let's not. Let's kind of moving on. I will change colour actually to show this, even though in my mind they're one and the same principle. Okay, overload can be broken down into three components. We can overload in terms of frequency. How frequently is the athlete training? So we often refer to this as number of times per week. How many times per week? And as a sort of a standard application, you could be thinking that a good application is 3 times a week for what we might loosely call the average performer. Okay, so 3 times a week. So we can increase frequency by going from 2 to 3 times a week, from going from 3 to 4 times a week as an athlete. We've got a second factor we can develop, and that is the idea of intensity. How hard are we working within the training experience? And how do we measure this? Well, we're interested in measuring things like percentages. If we measure the percentage of our heart rate max, whether we use 220 minus our age or whether we use the Carvonen principle, for example, we can work at a specific intensity. And of course, we can overload it as we progress in our training. In other words, we initially work at 70% of our heart rate max, but we gradually and steadily up it to 80 and 85% of our heart rate max, say. We can also look at the percentage of what we call our 1 rep max. So this would be things like resistance training. What percentage of our heaviest lift are we actually lifting within our training? Of course, we can up it as we progress, as we overload. And finally, if we do something like mobility training, stretching, we could look at the percentage ROM, the percentage range of motion. How far do we stretch the muscle through in its range of motion? And finally, we have duration that we can overload. Okay, duration. Any sensible person would simply call this time. But duration, what we're referring to here is that we can manipulate, for example, how many reps we do. We can manipulate that we do more sets in subsequent training experiences. And we can even manipulate the recovery period. Okay, so let's say that Katie Chapman here is working in interval training, and the first set of interval training she does, I don't know, let's say she does 6 sets of 5 reps over 50 meters, and there's a recovery of 3 minutes between sets. Well, of course, one of the ways that we can develop duration is we can reduce that 3 minutes down to 2 minutes recovery, or we can do more sets, or we can do more reps. All of those are duration or time. Now then, a couple of other points I want to make to you. I also want to talk to you about the concept of variance. Now, this is a really interesting idea. Variance is what we might refer to as the type of training. Okay, the type of training. Let me get that right. The type of training. So we might also say that we vary which muscle groups we work on. It's very typical that people performing resistance training, weight training, they do a lower body workout, they do a chest workout, they do a shoulders workout. I think this is not as popular as it used to be, but you can work on specific muscle groups to vary what you're doing within the gym. And of course, you can work on different energy systems. So if you go back to look at my principle of specificity, we can also vary the training by doing it this way. And there's a number of reasons to vary training. First of all, we want to prevent overtraining. Okay, so one of the ways of preventing overtraining is doing things that are varied enough, which means that you don't overtrain, say, a particular muscle or a joint, for example. But the other reason we might want to include variance in our training is it prevents repetitive injury. Now, let me tell you, repetitive injury, yes, can be tendonitis, something like tennis elbow, because we've been hitting a tennis ball too much. Or it could be, for example, a stress fracture of the tibia because we've been doing too many miles as a runner. But repetitive injuries are also what we might loosely refer to as burnout. And burnout is a psychological repetitive injury in the sense that we become psychologically and in terms of our motivation, we become demotivated because we haven't varied, or we haven't made training interesting enough, or we haven't made training, for example, progressive. We've overloaded too rapidly. So lots of information there. Your job is to now start applying these ideas. There's some question sets for you to answer, but apply them within your own training too. Thank you.